people. And newcomers to the state begin to realize the culture is a little different. But the culture is changing today. So then we end up with the nullification crisis of the 1830s, in which South Carolina contends, they can nullify federal tariff law because we're still sort of, just part of a group of states that are part of a nation. And Joel R. Poinsett, from whom the poinsettia name is named because he brought the plant here, native Charlestonian, spent a lot of his early years traveling around the world. He's a big hero today in Chile from his service there as U.S. ambassador when Chile was becoming a modern country. And he served several terms in Congress, and he served in President Andrew Jackson's cabinet. And he played the key role in stopping the nullification crisis. And he finally, in a series of letters with Jackson, he made it very clear to the leaders of South Carolina, you're going to have the whole United States Army down here. And once that was fully understood, it sort of began to resolve itself. He died in the 1850s, and he had retired before then. So then you ended up with South Carolina creating this mythical place where slavery was the most wonderful society on the earth, and that everybody took care of their slaves, and it was very beneficial to all, and it was a positive good. It brought the slaves into contact with Christianity and so forth. And so finally you end up with 1860 and the secession convention, which began in Columbia and then moved to Charleston or vice versa. I get them confused sometimes. And James L. Pettigrew said that South Carolina is not large enough to be a republic, and it's not small enough to be an insane asylum. And Pettigrew was actually very active in the nullification crisis 30 years earlier. But cooler heads did not prevail, and because there was so much honor involved in this southern concept of honor, which is probably heightened in this state. And one of the readings that went out said something about, the Civil War was the great duel. There was a lot of duels fought in South Carolina, even after the Civil War, the last one. And so it became sort of a point of honor. And then after the war, some of the leaders of the Confederate troops, like Martin Witherspoon, Gary, and Edgefield, said, South Carolinians never surrender. And so the whole value of the most valuable property in the state, which was slaves, was suddenly totally wiped out. Then you ended up with the Reconstruction that ended up allowing everyone, all males, to vote who were over the age of 21. The Reconstruction Constitutional Convention, which was the first time South Carolina had a state provision providing for public schools. So that's the source of public education in South Carolina, is the Reconstruction Convention of 1868. And but you also had the never surrender attitude. You had some of the biggest Ku Klux Klan trials in the nation were held in South Carolina. And finally you had the presidential election of 1876, in which Rutherford B. Hayes was elected by an 8-7 vote of a presidential commission in a contested election. I've got a book I'm completing which deals with that. But in any event, that essentially ended Reconstruction. But South Carolina had more African American members of Congress than any other state in the South. The Constitutional Convention had a African American majority, but almost all of them were literate. Many who had come down from the North, others had been sired by slave owners and sent abroad to study. Francis Cardozo, the state treasurer, was one of them. But Reconstruction was finally totally overthrown in 1877 with the compromise on the presidential election, and the last African American member of Congress left in 1901. The State Constitutional Convention of 1895 had 6 African American members, and they were very vigorous in their arguments made at that convention. And one of the compromises actually was a deal that Thomas E. Miller, who was ended up becoming the first president of South Carolina State College, now University in Orangeburg, and he had been a member of Congress briefly, and he struck a deal with Ben Tillman that allowed for the creation of that school. So it's also a complicated state. It's a complicated state. But South Carolina never recovered economically from the Civil War and its aftermath until after World War II, during and after World War II. Governor Olin D. Johnson got what is now Santee Cooper established from federal funding, sort of a state-owned, state equivalent of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Still very active, of course. And then Franklin Roosevelt had spent a lot of time in Georgia at Warm Springs, recuperating at least from his paralysis of polio. And in Georgia, he was considered sort of a leader of the partial leader of the Democratic Party. Georgian sort of Roosevelt when he first got elected as their president. And he in 1939 he said the South is the #1 economic problem. He said not the South's problem, the nation's problem. And when World War II started, James F. Burns of South Carolina, former congressman, former senator, former member of the Supreme Court until he resigned at Roosevelt's request to head the Office of War Mobilization, they were in sync in terms of the South getting a majority of new military bases and a lot of new military manufacturing facilities. Now, they didn't put it in those terms. They said, the climate is better for year-round operation of the military bases and so forth. But the idea was to help the South recover economically. So then you end up with World War II, and white Southerners and African American Southerners in segregated units. But especially white Southerners went abroad and went out of state and went out of their county, many for the first time. And they had broader visions when they returned, and many of the leaders of that group recognized that they had fought a war to preserve democracy. And South Carolina was very fortunate after the war. Burns ended up becoming governor of the state, and he was farsighted, but he didn't have the vision of someone like Fritz Hollicks, who came back and never forgot an incident when he was returning home from the war with a group, and they were in